even though in Greater Boston, we actually have very low rates of unsheltered homelessness because our emergency system is so robust and able to provide so many resources for people. Despite that, our system hasn't been able to keep up with the number of families that are requesting assistance from the system because, again, it's just so difficult for lower moderate income households to find a place to live.
The housing market in Greater Boston is broken. Super expensive, it's inaccessible for lots of people. And one of the key drivers of those high costs is that we are not building enough housing of all types. We are not building enough market rate housing. We are not building enough affordable housing.
Welcome to Building Well, Sustainable Homes, Equitable Communities, your new podcast from New Ecology. Join us as we explore real-life stories from key players in green building and community development. We'll examine exciting new innovations, highlighting practical solutions for creating more affordable, healthier, more resilient, equitable communities. We're building well together.
This episode was made possible by the Mass Save Community Education Grant.
Welcome to the Building Well podcast by New Ecology. I'm Michelle Moran, and this is today's host, Alina Michaelevich.
Hello.
We have two special guests today who are co-authors of the 2024 Greater Boston Housing Report Card, which is a report published annually by the Boston Foundation. Welcome to Aja Kennedy, Racial Wealth Gap Research Fellow with Boston Indicators and PhD candidate at Tufts University, and Katherine Levine Einstein, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston University. Each year, the Housing Report Card includes a special topic, and this year's focused on public land as an opportunity for increasing Greater Boston's housing stock. Join us on this episode to hear more about the state of the housing market in Greater Boston. So, welcome, Aja and Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks. We're really excited to talk to you about this research.
Awesome. Could you introduce yourselves and what you do?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Aja. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Tufts University. I study economics and public policy. Most of my research interests are in housing policy, but I'm also interested in social safety net programs more generally. I also work as a research fellow at Boston Indicators at the Boston Foundation, writing policy reports about the well-being of people in Greater Boston.
And I'm Katherine. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston University. I study and teach about local politics and policy with a particular focus on housing. And I also serve as the associate director of housing at the Initiative on Cities at Boston University.
Awesome. Could you tell us a little bit about Boston Indicators and Boston University Initiative on Cities?
Sure. Yes. So Boston Indicators is a small team of researchers that's housed within the Boston Foundation. And as I mentioned earlier, we write about the well-being of people in Greater Boston. So it tends to be a lot of stuff on housing policy, but we also write about retirement issues, health issues, transit, any place where we feel like we can kind of weigh in on policy and shed some light on equity concerns when it comes to local and state priorities. So yeah, glad to be here.
Katherine, could you tell us a little about Boston University Initiative on Cities?
Yeah, so Boston University Initiative on Cities really serves to connect researchers and students with cities both locally and around the world. So it supports both policy-engaged research and policy-engaged teaching.
That's great. All right. So tell us a little about the Greater Boston Housing Report Card. What is the Housing Report and how did you each contribute to it?
The Greater Boston Housing Report Card is a publication that the Boston Foundation puts out every year. And for the past 3 years, Boston Indicators has played a big role in writing what we call the core metrics section of the report card. So the overall report card tries to give the reader an overview of what's happening in the housing market in Greater Boston. That core metrics section is the section that kind of presents key metrics, as the name suggests, what's happening with housing prices, who's moving in and out of Boston, how are we looking on housing instability or homelessness, just a lot of different graphs and metrics that kind of describe what's going on with housing in Greater Boston. And then we also have a second section that's typically authored by an outside researcher, in this case with Katie Einstein at BU Initiative on Cities, and her co-authors. We normally have a special topic. This year's special topic that Katie is going to talk about later is about opportunities to use public land for affordable housing production. So yeah, two different sections of the report card. One's an overview of key numbers to help the reader understand what's going on in the housing market. And then we have this special topic that tries to highlight maybe an issue that doesn't normally come to the forefront as much in those conversations.
That's great. It has a lot of great graphs, I have to say. So if anyone's a nerd like me and Michelle, you'll love the report card. It's
Yeah,
pretty
and it
awesome.
kind of, especially that first section is kind of like a chart book, so that even if you don't read it from cover to cover, you can kind of flip through the sections and find something that's of more interest to you and see what the numbers are and how they're changing over time. So we try to make it quickly accessible to someone who maybe doesn't have enough time.
I'll also say my co-author, Max Palmer, who also is a professor of political science at Boston University, teaches data visualization and data science. So he will be very happy to
Oh.
hear that you guys were a fan of the data visualizations.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it is easy to flip through. I think that's one of its great benefits.
Awesome.
What trends have you seen in housing and homelessness? And what does it mean for affordable housing needs?
So that is a huge question in this area, talking about housing and homelessness, especially in the past couple of years. The way we talk about it in the report card is there's kinds of good news and bad news when it comes to housing and homelessness in Greater Boston. The bad news is obviously our rates of homelessness are very high. And Greater Boston has some of the highest rates of homelessness in the entire country. And that's probably not a huge surprise to anyone who's familiar with the housing market, unfortunately, because we have such high rent costs and housing prices. It just makes it very difficult for someone of lower moderate income to find a place to live. So that's the existing state of the Greater Boston area. Then on top of that, in the past couple of years, we've really had an uptick in the number of families that are requesting assistance from our state's emergency system. And so even though in Greater Boston, we actually have very low rates of unsheltered homelessness because our emergency system is so robust and able to provide so many resources for people. Even despite that, our system hasn't been able to keep up with the number of families that are requesting assistance from the system because, again, it's just so difficult for lower moderate income households to find a place to live. And so we've had a lot of immigrants from other countries come in recently. And again, because our housing market, it hasn't really found a place to accommodate people that have fewer resources, it's spun into this homelessness crisis that's been in the news in the past couple of years. And the state has been trying to figure out how to meet the needs of people who need housing immediately. It is an emergency, it's a problem. But also in the report card, we try and help people remember that even though there's this very acute crisis happening right now, it's also a reflection of more long-term trends in that the way that our housing market is, the fact that there are very low rental vacancies, et cetera, it kind of sets the stage for something like this to happen very quickly, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. It's certainly been in the news a lot, for sure. And the special topic report was really helpful in looking at that opportunity focus of it and how it can actually be addressed, which I think is really great. So we'll get to that shortly. One concept that I found really interesting in the report was the interest rate lock-in. Could you describe what that is and how it's affecting the housing market?
Yes, the interest rate lock-in is when we think about how much it costs someone to be able to own a home. We talk a lot about the sticker price of the house and how that's going up, but also another big contributor to the cost of purchasing a home is your interest rate, how expensive your mortgage is going to be. So in the prices section of the Greater Boston Housing Report Card in the metrics section, we have a little chart that breaks down some simulation of what it would have cost someone to purchase a home 3 years ago versus today. And in that chart, you can really see how the rise in interest rates over the past few years, especially after the pandemic, how that rise in interest rates has really contributed to a big jump in how much it costs to afford a home. So what does that mean for interest rate lock-in? So that means that if someone who purchased a home 3 years ago or a while ago when interest rates were lower, if someone has purchased a home at that time and maybe now they're considering moving or switching homes, they're going to be a lot less likely to make that decision to switch into a new home if they're looking at the interest rates that are available today and going, well, this doesn't make economic sense. Why would I get into a new mortgage when the price of a mortgage has gone up so much? So if we have a market where a lot of people are making a similar decision, that maybe they're a renter and they're thinking about buying a home, but they don't now, or if you're a homeowner and thinking about switching homes, but you don't because the interest rates are so high, that kind of locks people into where they currently live. And that means we're going to see less buying and selling activity on the market Again, in the prices section, we take a look at the numbers of new listings and the number of sales. And we're noticing that over time, we're seeing less and less sales activity, especially after the pandemic, since interest rates have gone up.
So that's really a challenge for owners. Could you talk a little about the income and wealth divide that you found between owners and renters?
We have this chart. You mentioned all the charts in the core metrics section earlier, and one of the ones that I really like is the one that looks at disparities in incomes between homeowners versus renters. And also in that same chart, we're breaking up homeowners and renters by different demographic groups. And in that graph, you notice something interesting, which is we tend to highlight disparities between different racial groups, which do exist, and you can see that on the graph. But also you can really see this huge gap between the incomes of renters and the incomes of homeowners. On average, the group of homeowners that have the lowest incomes are still above the group of renters that have the highest incomes. So it's two distinct groups, which again just illustrates how expensive it is to get into home ownership.
Yeah, that is a great graph. Could you talk a little bit about what you found in household size and affordable housing? And what's the potential impact of this on the housing market?
Talking a little bit more about household size is something we tried to introduce a little bit more in the report card this year. And there are so many factors to think about when we think about the size of a household. So maybe I'll just try and mention a couple of the trends and things to kind of illustrate what makes it so complicated. So on the one hand, for example, there's in our demographics section, there's one chart that shows that home ownership is becoming less prevalent among young adults. Especially a lot of that is coming from young adults who can't afford to either rent or own a home on their own. They can't afford to form their own household. A lot of times they might end up staying with parents or maybe staying with roommates, etc. So you can think of that as kind of an increase in household size beyond what there would have been. So maybe fewer households, but larger household size. On the other hand, nowadays, young households in Greater Boston have fewer and fewer kids than they used to. Since we might think of household sizes as getting smaller, there's kind of some competing trends here. Then I'll mention one third thing about household size, which concerns where seniors decide to live. So a couple of times in the report, we mention how older individuals who maybe might think about downsizing and moving into a different place to get a smaller place to live. Again, kind of going back to the interest rate lock-in idea that we talked about earlier, if it's becoming so expensive to move, if it's difficult to find an affordable place to buy or even to rent, those seniors are going to be less likely to move out into different housing. So in that case, they still might live in a larger unit, but still have a smaller household size. So there are a lot of different ways that the cost of housing can affect household formation and household sizes. There's so many dynamics when it comes to household formation that we kind of take into account when we think about what type of housing should be produced and what type of housing should be incentivized.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a big difference between somewhere where a family of 4 or 5 or 6 would live versus a 1-unit bedroom.
Exactly. Yeah, those are two different needs. Just having different types of housing that can accommodate different household sizes, hopefully at price points that are affordable to those households. It's not an easy vision to accomplish, but it is something that local policymakers have to really try and take into account and see how we can encourage types of housing to be produced that can really meet the needs of the households in Greater Boston.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, could you tell us what it means to be cost burden? That topic was covered a little bit in the report, and I'd like to highlight that one.
Yes, we mentioned cost burdens just about every year in the report card. When we talk about being housing cost burdened, for households that spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs, whether it be the cost of rent or utilities or their mortgage, if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing costs, we label you as cost burdened. In the report card, we look at renters and we look at homeowners, and we just quantify the share of households in each group that are cost burdened year after year. We continue to see that it is more common that a renter is cost burdened than for a homeowner. And we also see that Black and Latino households, especially renters, are more cost burdened than other households. But again, that's if you spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And it's also worth highlighting that even aside from just the cost of housing going up, inflation generally has been, if you think about, let's say, the 3 years after the pandemic, inflation generally has been going up, not only for housing costs, but for other costs. So even if you think about the other 70% of your income or whatever you would spend on these other costs, the purchasing power of that has also ticked down a bit. In this report, of course, we're just focused on housing cost burden, but just a reminder that that doesn't always illustrate the whole picture of people's cost burdens.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked on the podcast before about energy cost burdens, relative portion of your income that goes to utilities like electricity and gas.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely another part of the picture there.
Yeah, and as the climate continues to change, I can imagine it would only increase energy costs and other costs.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, there was a really crazy data point in the report that families need to earn over $110,000 a year to afford a median 2-bedroom apartment in Greater Boston. I
Yes.
found that really, in some ways, not surprising because I'm living in the Greater Boston area. But when you kind of step back and think about that, it's pretty surprising.
Yeah, and I'm glad that caught your eye because I think one of the things that we try and do in the report card is just find ways to help people understand how expensive it is to live in Greater Boston. And so that's just one little vignette that kind of hopefully paints the picture a little bit. So I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Lucas Munson, who kind of made that little chart and crunched the numbers to kind of give a typical example of what it would cost. So the way we came up with that number was just kind of a back of the envelope calculation. We took the median rent price of a 2-bedroom apartment in Boston, which is about like $2,300. And we added on the cost of typical utilities, which brought it to around $2,700 a month. If we're trying to estimate the income that it would take for someone to afford this apartment and not be cost burdened, it turns out it does come out to $110,000. So, of course, for each household, whether that makes sense is going to vary. But this was just kind of one example to show this is how expensive it is to live in Greater Boston.
What kind of jobs and salaries did you find were cost burdened?
Yeah, so this is another one tabulated by Lucas. So shout out to him. There are a lot of jobs in Greater Boston that would be cost burdened if we're looking at that medium 2-bedroom apartment. This includes a lot of really critical roles in our society: registered nurses, nursing assistants, home health aides. And we took the most common jobs in Greater Boston by looking at some information from Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we took all of those most common professions and looked at their median incomes. And out of the top 20 of the most common occupations, and there were only 4 of those 20 that would be able to afford that 2-bedroom apartment without being cost burdened. So the other 16 actually would be cost burdened. People who work in really critical roles in our local economy.
For sure. And that impacts everybody, right? It's like if you're in the
Yes.
hospital and your nurse had to travel hours to get to work because
Yes.
you can't afford to live near, that's impacting everyone. So I think
It impacts everyone, right? And it's first and foremost, it's important that people have housing to have a safe, stable place to live. But also beyond that, when we think of the greater economic consequences of having a housing market that's so expensive, it can be difficult for employers to attract employees to work at a place in Greater Boston if the housing is so expensive that that employee wouldn't be able to find a place to live. So if we're thinking about making sure we have enough of a nursing workforce or other critical roles like that, expensive housing is going to affect that. And so beyond the caring about the health of individuals, of humans that need a safe place to stay, also the economic consequences are definitely there when it.
Yeah, definitely.
Just another stat to further illustrate your point. Median sales prices in the Greater Boston area are now surpassing $1 million in 35 Greater Boston municipalities.
Yeah, which that blew me away when I saw that, because I actually didn't. I mean, I had heard that, some housing prices were getting expensive, of course. But again, that's just another way of illustrating in another way how expensive the housing is.
Yeah. Well, it'll be great to talk about the special topic in a second. But I have one more question or a couple questions before we get there. Could you explain to the listeners how it's possible that subsidized affordable housing still might be economically out of reach for lower income earners in Greater Boston?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that and bringing that up, because this is a thought that has come up to us as we're learning more about the subsidized housing stock. For us as researchers, we can take a little bit better look of, what the price breakdowns are and what the characteristics of the subsidized housing is that we have. So Housing Navigator Massachusetts, they have a data set that looks at all of the subsidized rental housing in the state of Massachusetts. Previously, we didn't have great data on subsidized housing, but now that we have that, we can take a look at these price breakdowns. And so some subsidized housing units are priced so that they're at a set price that is below market rate. So the way that they'll price it will be something like, okay, we want this unit to be affordable to someone who is making 80% of the area median income. So we're going to set this price so that if someone makes 80% of area median income, they will spend 30% of their housing costs on this house. But what that means is, even if someone who makes 50% of area median income rents that apartment, they will still pay the same price as someone who, made 80% area median income. It's very possible that someone who qualifies for this subsidized housing unit based on their income will rent this unit and still be cost burdened. Now, that's not the only way that subsidized housing is priced. Sometimes the rent price will be set based on the tenant's income. In that case, then that tenant will not be housing price burdened because, again, if it's someone who makes 50% of area median income, regardless of what income they make, 30% of their income will be spent on housing costs. And that way, that type of unit would be affordable to anyone at any place in the income distribution. Yes, it can be very possible that someone can be in subsidized housing and still be cost burdened. When we think of subsidized housing, they're not a monolith. It's not just like, oh, there's a subsidized housing unit. Now maybe some lower income households can afford it. It does get a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot of different factors that go into play when we think about whether or not our subsidized housing stock is appropriate for the needs that we have in Greater Boston. And looking at that pricing is just one of them.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And thanks for bringing in the disability accessibility as well. That's a really important point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello, homeowners and energy enthusiasts. Ready to save some money and make your home more efficient? I'm Molly with your Mass Save Minutes. Today we're talking all about how you can take advantage of incredible rebates and incentives from Mass Save, plus how you can benefit from their appliance recycling program. Let's get started. First up, if you're looking to upgrade your appliances, you'll want to hear about rebates and incentives for appliances and products offered by Mass Save. Whether it's a new refrigerator, dishwasher, washing machine, lawn equipment, or pool pump, plus many more, Mass Save has some fantastic rebates to help you save on energy-efficient models. These rebates can significantly lower the upfront cost of upgrading to products that not only save you money on your energy bills, but also reduce your environmental footprint. Now let's talk about another great opportunity, appliance recycling. If you're ready to upgrade your old, inefficient appliances, Mass Save will help you do so responsibly. Their appliance recycling program offers a $30 rebate for recycling your old dehumidifier and a program for recycling your old refrigerator or freezer. Plus, they'll handle all the pickup and recycling for you, making it easy to get rid of those outdated appliances and start fresh with new, energy-efficient ones. Here's how it works. Simply schedule a pickup for your old appliance, and once it's collected, you'll receive a rebate. It's a win-win, helping the environment while putting some cash back in your pocket. Head over to the Mass Save website at masssave.com, MASSSAVE.com, to learn more. That's it for today's Mass Save Minutes. Thanks for joining us. Remember, Mass Save isn't just for big projects. It can help with smaller renovations too. Until next time, stay informed and energy conscious.
So that's a great overview of some of the challenges that we're facing in Greater Boston. The report highlights that there's a lot of public land where subsidized housing could be built. What's the connection between all these trends we've talked about and the public land that's not currently being used for housing and how it could be used?
Yeah, so, Asha just did a great job of laying out the many ways that the housing market in Greater Boston is broken, right? Like, it's super expensive, it's inaccessible for lots of people. And one of the key drivers of those high costs is that we are not building enough housing of all types. We are not building enough market rate housing. We are not building enough affordable housing. when we think about what are the policy solutions to this really crippling regional challenge, we need to be thinking about building more housing. I think that's where in a lot of communities you hear people start saying things like, oh, we don't have enough land. We're totally built out. There's nowhere we could possibly even dream of putting this housing. And one of the things that we did in this special topic is say that is absolutely not true. There is so much land where we could be building housing. And what's more, it's publicly owned, which is going to allow us to build potentially some of the deeply affordable housing that is not economical to build on private land.
That's a great overview. So tell us a little about the barriers to actually building on that land.
Right. So first, if we just sort of ignore the issue of public land for a second, I think it's been really well documented that in Massachusetts and indeed in many places across the country, we make it way too hard to build housing. We create at the local level these incredibly onerous permitting processes through our zoning and land use regulation that mean that developers who want to build just like a townhouse, right, like not some sort of massive complex, they end up going through multiple hurdles just to get housing built. Every single one of these hurdles introduces opportunities for public opposition and maybe even like lawsuits to gum up the works and make it really hard to build housing, right? So that's just true for anything that you want to build, whether it's on private land or public land. But one of the things that we document in the report is that developing on public land adds all of these extra regulatory burdens. And many of these regulatory burdens come from a really understandable place of wanting to prevent corruption. But the problem is we've actually created a lot of state laws and state procurement laws that in practice make it incredibly difficult to convert this incredibly valuable asset, public land, into much needed affordable housing.
Is it fair to say that in many ways it's more challenging to develop on public land than privately owned land? And that's one of the challenges with addressing the housing crisis?
Yeah, it's really bleak, right? Because in an ideal world, we would make it easier to build on public land, which would make it cheaper to build on public land, which would make it more economically viable for us to build that incredibly affordable housing. But in practice, the exact opposite is true. And so we actually interviewed affordable housing developers as part of the special topic. And one of the things that they told us that really shocked us is that they would rather pay for privately owned land than have to deal with publicly owned land because it takes so much longer to build. And there's so many more places along the way where the regulatory process can potentially jump in and say, oh, nope, sorry, you can't build there. And just to give listeners sort of a concrete example of like, okay, what does that mean? What is the regulatory process that's making it so hard to build on public land? So in many communities across Massachusetts, right, they're governed by this form of government called town meeting. In town meeting forms of government, you have a legislative body that is either hundreds of people or even thousands of people, right? It could be like every registered voter in the town. And in many cases, if you want to build a housing development on publicly owned land, you have to get 2/3 support from town meeting. Anyone who's been to a town meeting knows that it's really easy to rile up anti-housing sentiment at these forums. And so it doesn't take a lot to delay or outright block proposed housing developments. And we document multiple cases in communities across the state where that exact process unfolds, where the town was like, hey, we'd like to have some affordable housing here. And oh, there's a developer willing to do it. And town meeting said, no, thank you. We don't want to see housing there.
I think highlighting those hiccups in the political process of producing housing is a very important part to add to conversations about what it takes to produce more housing. I think we talk a lot about zoning regulations and the price of construction materials going up and things like that. But when it comes to something like a very slow political process or other roadblocks on the road to building housing, for a developer, time is money. And so those delays really do cost money. And so I think it's great that Katie's highlighting that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to read a little stat for if these burdens were less or didn't exist, what could be. Almost 1/4 of land in Greater Boston is publicly owned, with the potential to create over 85,000 housing units if only 5% of the vacant non-conservation land is redeveloped. That's such a small amount of the available public land.
Yeah, so just to sort of help the listeners like really understand how much publicly owned land we potentially have available, right? So if we look at privately owned land, 87% of it is not vacant. So it's being used in some way. It's not like available for us to, build the affordable housing of our dreams. If we look in contrast at municipally owned land, only 32% of that land is non-vacant, 26% of it, according to the state tax parcel database, is conservation. So we don't want to build on our beautiful green spaces, wetlands, right? There's value to that conservation land. But 42% of municipally owned land is classified as vacant in the state parcel tax database. We don't think we should be building up all or even most of that land, right? So in our calculations, we were so conservative. We said, let's just imagine building 5% of the vacant land that local governments and the Commonwealth owns. And that's take as an assumption that we're going to build at the density that is allowed by MBTA communities. So that's 15 units per acre. So not a crazy amount of density, right? And that's going to produce a total, as you said, of 85,000 units under those really conservative estimates. So this is to us an untapped and squandered public resource.
I think that's a great point too, that it's the vacant land. It's not where you're playing basketball on the weekend. It's not where you're walking your dog in the morning. This is not parks or conservation land that we're talking about. It's 5% of the vacant land, which is kind of a different thing. I think also to connect it to the core metrics area, one of the things that was noted as happening in the housing supply was that it's higher costs, but also projects are stalling, new permits are decreasing, and these are all related to what Katherine just described.
Yeah, that even overall, aside from talking about public land, we're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown when it comes to production, especially for larger multifamily units. I kind of have to hesitate to be too definitive on that yet because the data that we get kind of has a time lag and it kind of takes a year later for us to really start to see what's happening with building permits. But so far, we do kind of see some evidence of what has been in the news about an anticipated multifamily housing slowdown. Again, that's even aside from using public land, just overall in general.
I think for the listeners thinking about the development of housing in Greater Boston and sort of thinking about how do I conceptualize this in the context of public land? It is terrible building housing across Greater Boston, right? We make it so hard to build housing of all types. And then on public land, we make it that much harder. So it's really that we have a sort of disastrous permitting process that the state is doing a lot, right? And they need to be doing even more. And we'll get to that when we talk about policy solutions. The state has taken really seriously that this is a big policy problem and is trying to streamline the permitting process. But all of these problems are just that much worse on public land.
Yeah.
The quicker you can make these type of processes, the more you can take away some of the uncertainty in the construction process.
Yeah, definitely. So our organization, New Ecology, sits at the nexus of affordable housing and energy efficiency sustainability. So I'm curious what tensions you see between affordable housing development and reaching Massachusetts climate goals, because sometimes they're kind of described as if they're at odds.
They shouldn't be at odds with each other because building dense transit-oriented housing in walkable communities is great for the environment, right? We reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because fewer people are driving places, right? There's so much good about building housing in that sort of dense, sustainable way. But I think all too often when we actually look at the nitty-gritty process by which housing is developed, we see that ostensibly pro-environment policies and people end up coming sort of, I would say, on the wrong side of the housing debate. Just two sort of clear examples of this. The first is that in a number of local governments, they have added environmental regulations that go beyond the state of Massachusetts' already strong standards when it comes to building near wetlands or things like that. And what we know, if we actually look at the data on those environmental regulations, is they make it more expensive to build and they ensure that we get fewer pieces of housing in those communities. And so I think there's a real question that we should be asking about whether some of those regulations have been added with exclusionary aims designed to prevent the construction of affordable multifamily housing. The second piece, if we actually look at the public meetings that we have as part of the housing approval process, we can see a number of people show up to those meetings in opposition to new housing, citing their environmental concerns, citing concerns about the local wildlife. And we obviously should be concerned as a part of our broader building in a sustainable way about how we're treating our wetlands when we build new housing. But I think oftentimes we see people sort of weaponize those environmental concerns as a way of fighting affordable multifamily housing that could potentially actually be supporting our climate goals.
You've also done work talking about how senior restrictions and subsidized housing similarly can also be used for exclusionary purposes. There's been a ton of work out there about how zoning regulations can be used for exclusionary purposes. So this is in the climate context of how those kinds of goals can be misused, but we kind of see it in other areas of housing policy as well.
Yeah. I love what you started with, that transit-oriented affordable housing really serves climate goals, walkable cities, sustainable communities. So I think it's really important to focus on that aspect. The environmental regulations certainly can be a challenge. I'm curious if you could tell us a little more. There's a section in the report about this concept of weaponizing public land, and there was a bit of consternation around this concept. There was an article in the Boston Globe in November 25th, which talked about the report and this sort of concept. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did is we did a little bit of a deep dive over the last 10 years and looked at times when towns purchased large plots of land. And we're like, okay, what are they doing with this public land? How often are they building housing? How often are they using it for other things? And what we found really shocked us. We found 13 instances of cities and towns across Massachusetts buying public land expressly to block the development of housing. In almost all cases, it was actually to block the development of affordable housing. These cities and towns spent over $50 million in public resources. In many cases, it was actually in part sort of subsidized by the state government. They blocked over 1,000 identifiable units of housing. So this is really concerning when we think about all of the challenges we have to building new housing, right? Like, this shows us just how much some communities don't want to see new housing. They are willing to raise their own taxes to block the development of affordable housing in their communities.
Why do you think there's such public opposition to housing projects?
This is something I've thought a lot about in research, like beyond this special report. So I think there's a number of reasons. One is that people just don't like change. And new building is this incredibly visceral and highly visible change, right? So I think people react negatively to change. I think there are some people who perceive new housing as a threat to their property values. For most of us, right, if we own a home, that's the most expensive thing we own. And we don't want to see sort of our wealth diminished in ways that people might perceive new development to do. And then finally, I think we cannot overlook sort of racism and classism baked into housing opposition, particularly if we're thinking about opposition to affordable housing. But yeah, I think you're correctly identifying, like, people have a really visceral and strong opposition to housing, and it's such a challenging barrier to overcome. In other research that we did, we actually went out and looked at all of the people who participate in public meetings about housing developments and found that only 15% of people who show up to those meetings show up in support of new housing. It's a huge problem and a real challenge as we think about trying to accomplish our affordable housing goals in the state and beyond.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits that affordable housing can provide for the community, because that's sort of the opposing side, right? Is like, here's all these benefits to affordable housing. And I think we've touched on a few, like making it so that, say, a nurse could live closer to the hospital. Tell me a little bit about what you see as the benefits of affordable housing.
So first, to start with the benefit of affordable housing, I want to start with like a debunking a myth. It does not reduce your property values. So for all those people who are like anxious, like, oh my gosh, they're going to build, 10 units of affordable housing. What will this do to my home value? The answer is nothing. Like, it's not going to do anything to your home value. But what are the benefits, right? We allow people to have access to safe and stable housing. And we know that that contributes profoundly to people's physical and mental well-beings. It contributes to their economic well-being, right? So just that access is so, so important. We also know that socioeconomic diversity improves educational outcomes, right? So if we have more affordable housing in a community and create more socioeconomic and racial diversity, that is better for the education of every single child in that community from all different backgrounds. We provide greater equality and access to high quality public goods when we build more affordable housing.
And I'll also tack on one thought about how having access to opportunities to live in different neighborhoods can help economic mobility and things like that. Baked into that is also some differences in how social networks are formed. The more that income segregation goes up and we have these siloed communities, that limits opportunities for people from different groups or different backgrounds to build networks and get to know each other, not only for economic mobility purposes. If you live in an area where there are a lot of, working professionals, maybe you have access to learning about all these different jobs or different ways that you could spend your time. So, not only for those purposes, educational and work, but also just for community building. I think it's kind of unsettling the more we get siloed into these different communities and don't get the opportunity to really get to know different kinds of people.
Yeah. There's so many ways that it can benefit existing residents, future residents. Like affordable housing has a great power to improve our lives and the quality of life in communities. So it's really great that you guys are thinking about how that can be made more possible in Greater Boston. I also want to note that we talked a lot about like housing as a commodity, or like people are paying, they're paying for it. There's ownership, it's wealth, all of that, but it's also considered a human right, right? So this is also just the right thing to do, is provide housing for everybody in our Greater Boston community. And that's such an important aspect that I think sometimes it's easy to kind of forget about that.
There's really great research, going back to a point Aja made earlier, talking about homelessness in Greater Boston, right? So there's really great research that looks nationally at what are the places that are experiencing the worst homelessness crises. And it's about housing costs, right? It's not about places that are having worse mental health crises or places that are having worse addiction crises, right? It's about the broader context of the housing market. And so if we're thinking about this issue of housing as a human right, our failure to build enough housing and to keep our housing market affordable is the reason that we're seeing this uptick in homelessness, and we're seeing profound human suffering in our community.
Yeah. So let's get action oriented. What policy changes did you identify that could help more public land be developed? Because that's a great solution that you've identified in the Greater Boston Housing Report Card.
So I think there's a number of different solutions that, I really hope that the state government is able to implement. And the first is to streamline the process for the disposition of public land. Ideally, this wouldn't be going through town meeting and certainly wouldn't require a 2/3 majority vote. One of the other sort of fun features for developers who are building on public land is they essentially end up going through the review process twice, which I think we've documented already in this podcast that the review process is pretty nightmarish for developers, but they have to go through it once to get approved as the builder on public land. And then once they get approved as the builder on public land, they get to go through it all over again to actually do the building. And so we think there are a number of steps the state could take to prevent developers from having to go through as many hurdles, right? There clearly needs to be some process in place to prevent corruption in the disposition of public land, but there probably are ways that we could make this process be much faster and much more predictable. I think the second thing that we'd really like to see is the state take steps to make sure that state resources cannot be used to purchase land to block affordable housing development. And so we propose reforms to this law called the Community Preservation Act, which has been used in about half of the cases that we identified in the report to purchase land to block the development of affordable housing. We also think that this is maybe a less likely to be impactful reform, but a very realistic one. We think that the state can provide helpful resources like technical assistance for helping local communities navigate this really complicated process for using their public land to build housing. So we think that's like a low-hanging fruit and something really easy for the state to do. The last thing that I would sort of say is a policy recommendation is we would really love to see the state continue to push local governments to streamline the housing permitting process generally. We are recently starting to see the fruits of a state law called MBTA Communities, which is requiring local governments served by the MBTA to increase allowable density. And, we've seen one town, I would not have guessed necessarily this was going to be our model town beforehand, but we've seen Lexington really come out in front. They have over 1,000 housing units in the pipeline right now because of MBTA Communities. So I would like to see more cities and towns follow the example of Lexington and reform their zoning in a way that actually allows for the meaningful construction of large numbers of new housing.
That's great. When you think about next year's housing report, what trends would you like to see? Like in an ideal world, a year from now, what would the housing report card look like?
I want to see those housing units in the pipeline. So we've seen a lot of communities engage in what is called paper compliance with MBTA communities, where they are technically complying with state law, but they haven't actually meaningfully streamlined their permitting processes. And so I want to see more communities follow the great example that Lexington has set, which shows us that like if we streamline these permitting processes, building is actually possible. And so I want to see more housing getting built, and I want to see that potential of public land unlocked by the state government so that we see those deeply affordable units getting permitted on public land.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And just to tack on to what Katie was saying about hopefully more units being produced under MBTA communities, hoping also that some of those units might be affordable to lower moderate income households. In one of the Boston Indicators Upzone updates blurbs that we have, we talked a little bit about affordability concerns with MBTA communities because there is no requirement that, the zoning regulation require that units be below market rate, but some communities can opt in to have their inclusionary zoning restrictions apply to those MBTA communities zones. So there's not really a clear-cut, across the board, consistent expectation of what affordability will look like in these different zones that municipalities have defined under MBTA communities. But I'm hoping that some of the housing that is hopefully produced under these new regulations will be affordable to lower moderate income families.
That's awesome. That's great. I think that's a great note to end on. So hopefully we can reconnect in a year on the housing report card and we'll see some good progress there.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have good news to report on progress next year.
Every year we do this report thinking we're going to find something optimistic. Like we actually thought public land would be like an optimistic story, and I don't know why we did, but yeah, maybe next year we'll have something good to report.
Yeah, maybe you'll see some progress. I mean, all the effort,
thank you so much.
Not for naught. Yeah, thank you, Aja and Katherine. This was really a great conversation. I learned a lot. It's awesome.
Yeah,
and thank you for your work on the report card as well. It's amazing work.
Thank you.
Thank you to Aja Kennedy and Katherine Levine Einstein. It was great to have them both on the podcast to talk about the Greater Boston Housing Report Card. These are put out annually by the Boston Indicators via the Boston Foundation. You can find the reports, this year's and the prior years, as well as many other reports around demographics, immigration, racial wealth, on the Boston Foundation's website in the reports section. We hope you'll check that report out and also check out the show notes for the article from the Boston Globe and some of the other resources that we mentioned. There's a lot of great information here, and as we mentioned, many great graphs. See you next time.
For more information on what we spoke about on today's episode, the show notes and transcript are available at newecology.org/buildingwell-podcast. You can find more information on Boston Indicators and the Boston Foundation, including the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, at tbf.org. You can also find them on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or Vimeo at the Boston Foundation. You can find New Ecology on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and X at New Ecology Inc. See you on the next episode.
This episode was made possible by the Mass Save Community Education Grant.
The Season 1 Building Well podcast committee at New Ecology is led and organized by Alina Michaelevich and Michelle Moran, with Molly Kraft and Michael Abdelmessi.